I'm Beth Perrell. Dr. Alice Davidson is a professor of psychology at Rollins College, and recently she wrote a guest column in the Orlando Sentinel entitled Math Textbooks Also Teach Students to Grow, Manage Emotions, and we're going to talk about that with Dr. Davidson. Welcome. I appreciate you joining me today. And this was prompted, as you write in the piece, because Florida rejected 42 math textbooks recently, in fact, even more than that, because they said that they included approaches that were not sanctioned by the state. And one of them, which is what we're going to talk about a lot, is social and emotional learning. So thank you for joining me. And do you mind starting there and giving us all a little sense of the definition or a primer in what is social and emotional learning?
Sure, absolutely. And I just would like to start off by saying thank you so much for having me here today. It's such a pleasure to chat with you about this issue. And, as a developmental psychologist whose research and teaching focuses on children's social, emotional, and academic development, and as a college professor who teaches statistics to undergraduate students, many of whom have some intense feelings about math, and also as the proud mom of an OCPS elementary school student, this issue is really important to me. So I appreciate you inviting me to chat with you today. So if you'd like, I could talk a little bit about kind of what the issue is and then sort of define social emotional learning to give people sort of a sense of sort of what is going on right now, sort of what the context is. So on Friday, April 15th, the Florida Department of Education announced that the state rejected 54 math textbooks, 41% of submissions from next school year's curriculum, as you mentioned, and they cited references to objectionable material, including, as you stated, the unsolicited addition of social emotional learning. So they also cited references to critical race theory, which we know has been a hot button issue in the state and across the US as of late, as well as inclusions of Common Core, which Florida has disbanded in favor of the BEST standards. And in the original announcement, the DOE did not provide examples of the objectionable material, allegedly because of publishers' proprietary content. And so this apparently was a big surprise to many school administrators across the state, including in local Central Florida counties such as Orange, Seminole, Lake, and Osceola, who had already reviewed and selected their textbooks for the 22-23 academic year from Florida's initial list of 132 textbooks that were crafted to meet the state's new BEST standards, which must be taught starting in August. So obviously, districts wanted new math books aligned to those standards on campuses by August, and they were preparing to pay millions of dollars to purchase those texts in the near future. So that was Friday, April 15th. Then on the following Monday, April 18th, Governor DeSantis was speaking at a press conference in Jacksonville. And in response to a question about the textbook rejections, he brought up this topic of social emotional learning and said that, that it was related to some of the other things that are more political in there, and mentioned that math is about getting the right answer. It's not about how you feel about the problem. And then he went on to state that, this topic has not been proven to be effective, and said, quite frankly, it takes our eye off the ball. And this is simply not true. And this is, I think, to get to your question about what social emotional learning is. Social emotional learning is so important for children of all ages, and not only for teaching children how to deal with their relationships and strong emotions, but also for enhancing their learning of critical academic skills and core academic content. So there's this collaborative organization, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, referred to as CASEL, and they define social emotional learning as the process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. So that's kind of a long definition, but more specifically, and I would encourage listeners to go to the casel.org website. It's a great website to learn kind of more about social emotional learning. But more specifically, it's a framework of 5 core competencies, often referred to as the CASEL 5. And the first one is self-awareness. And this refers to understanding your own emotions, values, and personal goals. So this would be like being able to identify when I'm feeling angry or frustrated, what that emotion is that I'm feeling. A second core competency is self-management, and this has to do with skills and attitudes that help regulate emotions and behaviors, so such as impulse control, so not shouting out the answer when you have it. If the teacher has told you to be quiet and sit quietly until everyone's finished. Also the ability to delay gratification, growth mindset. A third competency is social awareness. So this has to do with the ability to take the perspective of others who maybe have different ideas than you, different experiences than you, or different in terms of background or culture, and to empathize and act with compassion. Then the fourth competency is relationship skills. So this has to do with maintaining healthy and satisfying relationships and acting in accordance with social norms. And then finally, the fifth competency is responsible decision making. So this has to do with making healthy choices about personal behavior and social interactions. So being able to appropriately take turns and listen to your peers and respond appropriately, not running out of line when your class is walking from the classroom to the cafeteria, things like that. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the organization of CASEL, but that is sort of a long definition of what social emotional learning is, and then these 5 core social emotional learning competencies.
Let me ask you this, because as you were saying all of that, I'm envisioning sitting in a math class as a young person. And, the idea of it's about getting the right answer suggests that I just need to look at the back of the book and look at the answer, right? And that's
Right.
kind of like, or I don't know if they still do that, but when I was young, you looked at the back of the book and there was the answer. That really learning math is about learning the process, and those qualities you just mentioned from CASEL are about the idea of having the courage to ask a question if I need it, recognize that there's more than one way to get to that end result, to recognize about my emotions so that I can be resilient, and even when it gets tough, to keep going. I mean, these are some of the things that were swirling around my mind as you were talking. Is there any kind of connection in what I was wondering to what you were
Yes.
saying?
Absolutely. I think everything you said is absolutely true. And those kind of experiences that you talked about are absolutely involved in doing math. And so, for sure, there might be a right answer that we're hoping children arrive at when they are working to solve a problem. But the process of getting there can involve so many of these social and emotional experiences and tools that can help children be more successful in arriving at that right answer, understanding the process, understanding why they're doing what they're doing. So I can give you a few specific examples. So I was recently speaking to a good friend of mine who is an elementary school teacher, and she was telling me that they use SEL language with kindergartners when they're teaching math and science. So for example, they'll say things like, today you're going to be pinball engineers. And so they are trying to encourage these 5-year-old children to think like scientists, to think like mathematicians, to think about how a pinball machine works as they're learning about motion. And so in getting children to sort of assume this mindset, they're building on their natural curiosity and their desire to experiment. And they have the children work in small groups to kind of think and learn, what a pinball engineer might have to do and how they might explore motion. And through this experience, children absolutely have to use SEL skills to be successful. So they have to demonstrate persistence. They have to engage in turn taking, right? They don't get to be the one who it gets to dominate the pinball machine. They have to demonstrate self-awareness. So all of these skills are involved in learning math and science concepts, some of these STEM concepts that we hear a lot about lately. And I will say that, I teach statistics to undergraduate students, and I love it. It's one of my favorite courses to teach. And I have so many wonderful students, and many of them come in with a lot of math anxiety. And on day one, I acknowledge this and I attempt to normalize that. So I'll do an anonymous poll and ask them various questions about, why they're taking the class, what they're looking forward to, and what, if any, concerns they have. And they have a lot of concerns. So they have stress and anxiety associated with learning math, their whole sort of personal narrative or history about the struggles they've had in the past. They bring all that into the classroom when they are coming to learn something new. And so throughout the semester, we talk about things like growth mindset, focusing on effort and what it takes to put in that sort of incremental effort or growth to sort of master material, instead of viewing your statistics ability as being something that's fixed, something that's non-changeable. We talk about struggle and perseverance, how we can learn from failure. Okay, you bombed this first quiz. What are we going to do to approach studying for the next quiz or mastering the material? Thinking of yourself like a statistician, self-efficacy. These are all SEL concepts that aid in my ultimate goal of teaching them how to, for example, compute and interpret a standard deviation or conduct a regression analysis. So these tools do not detract from the important core math concepts, or in my case, the statistics that I'm teaching my students. They enhance their ability to master these skills. And then finally, I wanted to share this example that I saw just in the last week when sort of all this news has come out, that one mom was sharing that her 10-year-old daughter, who just a few days ago was in her classroom, and the class was doing their FSA math prep. So FSA stands for Florida Standards Assessment. So they were doing the math prep, and the teacher reached out to this mom and said that her 10-year-old had her head down on her desk, was visibly upset. The teacher went over to investigate, and she saw that the child was in tears because she couldn't remember some math facts. And so I think this is just an important example to point out that the pressure on these children is a lot. And of course, we want them to master important fundamental academic skills that are going to allow them to be prepared for college and jobs that may require advanced math skills. And I absolutely hear the concerns from some people that say, oh, too many high school students and entering college students lack some of these fundamental academic skills, particularly STEM skills. And I share some of these concerns and have at times experienced this frustration myself. But I also know, and the research supports, that incorporating SEL language and tools into the teaching of math, it does not detract from the acquisition of these skills. It actually enhances it.
Some things I've taken away from those examples. The idea, number one, that it isn't just about today in this class, that you're looking for how to apply outside of the classroom these math concepts, the pinball example. The idea that how well you've had with your experiences with this subject is still with you, and you're saying that with the right SEL kind of concepts, that can help somebody to persevere so that they can, down the line, apply it in some way. Those college students, for example, go into certain skills. But the other thing that I find myself wondering about is and your examples kind of underscore this, that you can't parse out the subject, like learn the math from everything else, take the math outside of the science. I mean, I think about teaching someone to cook something, and I'm a horrible cook, so I'm very aware of this. You got to do math, right? As you go through the recipe, you've got to do chemistry, as you think about, as I do, burning things. And so it's hard for me to kind of look at how a textbook could boil down to just the subject.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yes, I absolutely know what you mean. Yeah, I think so. You bring up some really good points. It's sort of, what I hear you saying is that it seems to be inextricably linked to math content. Sort of, how can you take away struggle and intense feelings, or the idea that these concepts are not just specific to the problems that are in your textbook, and that they're not going to be applied in other sort of contexts or realms in your life? Is this
taking the statistics too? I mean, you obviously have to show statistics, which are of different life matters. And I believe that in one of the examples the state did offer, wasn't it about racial issues and and, the statistics, the graph was about that.
Yes. And so you bring up a really important point, which is that we really don't have a good sense of what the concerning or objectionable material is or was at this point. So obviously, after the DOE sort of made this announcement, there have been lots of questions. And a few days ago, they released on their website several offerings that kind of showed some examples of questionable content. One of them, as you mentioned, was a graph that depicted, I believe, participants' responses to the implicit association test, which is a test that's used often in social psychology classes to assess implicit racial bias. My understanding is that this was an example of a high school math textbook or a math example. And so, but it's unclear why exactly that example what was the basis for which that example was rejected? Were they believing that it had to do with critical race theory because there was something about racism in there? It didn't necessarily appear to have to do too much with social emotional learning. The two examples that sort of explicitly mentioned SEL, of the four examples that they shared, one of them noted an objective of building proficiency with social awareness as students practice empathizing with classmates. And then the other referenced the CASEL 5, those 5 core competencies I mentioned, with an emphasis on building student agency. But there were no concrete examples of the math problems, which textbooks those excerpts came from, or for what grade or age these problems were developed. So it's just, it's really difficult for me to understand kind of what is objectionable about incorporating some of this language about social awareness or student agency when we're talking about teaching children math. So it's I think there's still really big questions about what exactly the questionable math problems were. So yeah.
So obviously you and I are talking about this because, we're members of the community. A lot of us have kids in the school systems, and we wonder about this. We want the right thing for our children. So what would you say to listeners regarding this issue? And maybe this draws from the original piece you put in the Sentinel.
Sure, absolutely. So I would say that I think most people can agree that we care about children having a strong set of social and emotional tools. So being able to identify and manage your emotions, to get along well with other people, to have healthy and satisfying relationships. I think what's really important to point out to people is that SEL and core academic subjects, things like math, that's the particular issue we're talking about here, but also literacy and science, the learning of these things are not mutually exclusive. And I think that any teacher would tell you this. And there's a lot of research to support it. So I mentioned this in the column that I wrote, but there's research by Mark Greenberg and colleagues that has found that having better social and emotional tools for managing relationships and strong emotions, it actually helps children learn and perform better in the short and long term because it enhances their school engagement and their academic performance, while it's reducing their conduct problems, shouting out, being disruptive in class, and promoting desirable social behavior. So being able to respectfully disagree with a classmate, or to be able to ask someone for something in a respectful but polite way. There's a widely cited 2011 meta-analysis conducted by Joseph Durlock and colleagues that examined 213 studies involving more than 270,000 students. And they found that SEL interventions that addressed these 5 core competencies increased students' academic performance by 11 percentile points compared to students who did not participate. So SEL is not something that's replacing important academic learning with, kind of touchy-feely subjects that are resulting in overly sensitive children with inflated self-esteem, if that's maybe where people think that there's an issue. Absolutely not. SEL teaches children how to be socially and emotionally competent humans, which in and of itself is so important. And that contributes to a better learning environment where academic engagement and performance is enhanced. And I think that's what I hear the governor and the education and commissioner saying is what we should care about children's academic performance. So SEL is a tool that enhances these things. And I would just, I also wanted to point out too, I think I've kind of already touched on this, but I think, to the point that any, especially elementary school teacher, can tell you that having a positive, calm, respectful social environment facilitates better learning and academic performance. My daughter is a student in OCPS, and the teachers she's had have done a masterful job of kind of creating this environment or establishing important instructional routines and procedures. And what I mean by that is that this sort of social emotional foundation, teaching children to inhibit their impulse to shout out the answer when they have it, turn taking, persisting when problems are challenging, using respectful language when they disagree, things like this foundation of social emotional learning, so that they can build on that, have a more productive discussion or lesson regarding academic content with that foundation in place. How are you supposed to teach third graders to do multiplication if a couple of children are always shouting out the answer or throwing their pencil down when they're struggling or disrupting the learning of the peers around them? You can't. And I would also add that there are quite a few evidence-based standalone social emotional programs. One of them is called PATHS, Promoting Alternative Thinking Skills. It's a program that was developed by researchers at Penn State. It's wonderful. It's resulted in some of these academic gains that I talked about. And I fully support these programs, but I recognize they also take up more class time. I think if you can incorporate SEL seamlessly into core content, learning to, problem solve like a mathematician, then that's a win. And I think that most teachers do not view SEL and core academic content as mutually exclusive.
But another thing that you're bringing up is that a textbook isn't sort of the standalone item in the student's learning. It's how it is integrated into the classroom and into what the instruction is.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, yes, I think that the instructions that the teacher gives, so that children have clear expectations about what they're supposed to do, what they're supposed to be working on in class, instructions for if they're going to be doing independent work or work in a small group, if they have manipulatives to use, like the pinball machine, or if we're talking about the early elementary school grades, maybe they're working with, different small items that they can group and sort and count and things like that. And so absolutely, it's not just the textbook that they're using, but they're, all of the other kind of instructions and materials that go along with it. And that brings up another, I think, really concerning issue with what's happening in Florida right now, because what we've learned since this announcement in the last week is that the textbooks that are on the department's not recommended list include the offerings from 4 of the 5 publishers that submitted bids to provide a kindergarten to 5th grade math series to Florida's public schools. And apparently the remaining option, which is referred to as STEM Scopes by a company called Accelerate Learning, according to their website, it says that this curriculum is centered on a digital platform. And this is a real concern because elementary school students should not be learning math predominantly through an online format. They should have access to printed math books. They should learn to solve math problems by hand. There's plenty of research to show that using finger counting and manipulatives, printing enhances children's acquisition of math skills. My daughter actually in the kind of first full year of the academic did virtual school through OCPS, and online math is really challenging, even in first grade. It's tough to carry the one when you're working out an online math problem. So I think this is another concern in addition to the issues we've discussed about social emotional learning.
Okay, what I'd like you to do is to take it from the other side, though, if and I'm not saying be a math teacher here or whatever, but how do you make a decision then at the state level about what textbooks will do the job?
Yeah, so I think that we have these BEST standards. So BEST stands for Benchmarks for Excellent Student Thinking. So this is what replaced Common Core in the state of Florida. And so these are to be implemented or to be taught starting in August. And so these BEST standards have been developed in consultation with, experts who teach and know the subject and sort of the objectives for children of particular ages. And so I think that obviously it's important that the curriculum that's being used is aligning with these standards. And I was looking through them yesterday. My daughter's in second grade, so I was kind of looking at the benchmarks for second grade math. And when I look at one of these standards, it says actively participate in effortful learning both individually and collectively. And then there's a list of kind of what those benchmarks are. So for example, analyze to address that particular standard. So for example, analyze the problem in a way that makes sense given the task, ask questions that will help with solving the task. And then there are three benchmarks that to me sound like they contain some social emotional type language in them. Build perseverance by modifying methods as needed while solving a challenging task. Stay engaged and maintain a positive mindset when working to solve tasks. Help and support each other when attempting a new method or approach. So I think I agree that these are important. I think that it's hard for me to imagine a job, whether someone eventually is going to be designing a new roller coaster for Disney or doing math having to do with assessing the water quality in our lakes and rivers in Florida. You're going to have to persevere. You will have to work with other people. You're going to have to develop critical thinking skills to look at multiple angles of a problem, to try something, and if it doesn't work, examine why, consult with other people, explore sort of multiple pathways for arriving at a successful outcome or the sort of result that you are striving for. So I think that I think that the sort of primary goal for choosing a math textbook, getting back to your specific question, is making sure that the text is aligning with these standards that have been developed. But then I think if you can incorporate social emotional learning seamlessly into the delivery of those standards and benchmarks, great. And so, it might even be, and I've seen some examples of textbooks where there might be sort of a cartoon type character with a bubble coming out of her mouth that talks about having a growth mindset to approach whatever this new unit is, something like that. That's something that it's an image that the children see in their math textbook. It's something that they read. It's something that the teacher might underscore, but it's also not taking up hours of precious class time away from teaching them how to learn fractions or how to do multiplication.
Let me give you an opportunity for anything you want to say that we haven't touched on.
Sure, thank you. I think that when we are stepping back and thinking about why the rejection of social emotional learning from academic content is a problem or why it should be that concerning, I think, maybe if some parents are concerned about, well, children are maybe getting this in other aspects of the curriculum or other parts of the day, and so maybe it's not necessary in math. I think it's so important for us to remember how difficult these past 2 years of the pandemic has been for children and teens. We know that depression and anxiety symptoms in children doubled during the pandemic. Children who were out of school, isolated from their peers, and were lonely, they missed out on important opportunities to practice social and emotional skills such as impulse control, interpreting and responding to their own and others' emotions, dealing with conflict, reacting peacefully to difficult peer encounters. And so SEL concepts such as growth mindset and perseverance can equip children to manage their emotions, such as frustration, in order to persist with challenging social and academic problems. So I would argue that at a time when so many of us are just exhausted and on edge, equipping children with tools to navigate stress and uncertainty in relationships, this is more important than ever. So this is not the time to be getting rid of social emotional learning from our curriculum. We really need to reinforce these important tools. And what I hope people can take away is that these things are not mutually exclusive. We can teach these skills alongside core subjects without detracting from important academic content that aligns with state standards.
Dr. Alice Davidson is a professor of psychology at Rollins College. I'm Beth Perrell.